The Russian forces made significant gains in the direction of Menrat, where they managed to gain control over the remaining parts of the apartment complex area in the eastern section of the city, additional advances to the south of the city, and in the central parts where the Russians have started storming the industrial area. In addition to this, the Russians have also managed to advance within the residential areas in between them for a front-wide advance. With this, the Russians are now closer to gaining full control over the city. With the capture of the remaining portion of the apartment complex area, the Russians now have full control over the eastern outskirts of the city, allowing them to build up their forces within it and allow them to develop offensive operations from it, with the buildings overlooking the entire southern parts of the northern section of Menrat. The Russians can advance from the eastern flank towards the apartment complex area in the now southern part of the city, with additional advances from the south to clear the front from the southern flank and advance into the apartment complex area from that direction as well. And with the push into the central industrial area, the railway station area, and the apartment complex buildings in the central parts of the city, the Russians are also able to storm it from the north. This apartment complex area in the southern part of the city is likely the final stronghold of Ukrainian forces within Menrat, where they can be spread throughout the entire apartment complex area that shifts from the northern to the southern parts of the southern section of it. While there is some industrial buildings along the railway line here in the central parts of the city, the Russians will likely clear them much faster than the southern apartment complex area, and the northern section is also fairly isolated. So with this, the final stronghold of the Ukrainians is the southern apartment complex area, which the Russians are now reaching from the eastern, southern and northern flanks for the final push to end the encirclement of Menrat, close to encirclement, and develop offensive operations beyond Pokrovsk and Menrat in the direction of Reshene to the northwest, Rodensky, and onwards towards Belitsky in the north. In addition to these advances, there are numerous advances throughout the front line where the Russians have managed to advance to the south of Kupyansk, to the west of Siversk, as well as within Siversk itself, where the Russians are now close to gaining full control over the town. To the south of this, the Russians also managed to advance in numerous directions, including the Zaporizhia, Dnipropetrovsk, and eastern portion of the Donetsk region. The Ukrainians managed to regain some positions here to the southwest of Pokrovsk and in the direction of Kupyansk. The Russian advance being here in the direction of Oryhovo-Vasilivka, and the Ukrainian advance in the vicinity of Novopavlivka, where they're looking to cut off the supplies to Russian forces operating within the town. The Russian advance here in the Dnipropetrovsk region and the Ukrainian advance within the Kupyansk region are largely just extensions of the gray zone, and that is because the forces that managed to push through were not the main forces. They were not able to consolidate the positions and were struck down and hunted by the other side's drone warfare after they were geolocated at their positions. But it is clear the Russians are here looking to bypass the second line of defense in the Zaporizhia region and outflank the Ukrainian forces in the area, while the Ukrainians are here aiming at cutting off the supplies to the Russian forces operating within Kupyansk. Starting out in the southwest, the Russians expanded their zone of control in the northern outskirts of Huliepole, gaining control over additional parts of the residential area in the northern flank of the Haichur River. The Russians also managed to gain control over the fortifications on the northern outskirts of the city. With this, the Russians have a clear road through the fortifications into the city itself. However, the Ukrainians still have several positions along the forest lines to the west of it, which allows them for direct fire control towards the road. Although the road itself is clear, the flank has yet to be cleared. The Russians gain control over the forest lines here in between the river line in the north and the Haichur River. Then the Russians will have a clear road towards Huliepole itself. But again, long-range strikes can still strike the Russian forces as they drive into it. The Russians are here working to gain full control over the northern bank of the Haichur River, to gain full control over the Huliepole residential section in the area. The Russians are also attempting to outflank the fortifications by pushing through from the northern flank and into Huliepole, connecting the northern and southern banks of the Haichur River line. The Russians are here developing to connect their forces between the north and the south while isolating the Ukrainian crossing between the north and the south. With this push, the Russians are closer to gaining control over additional entryways into the city and securing these entryways into the city. As for the northern flank, there were some developments in the direction of Ostapivsk, where the Russians claim to have gained control over the town, with geolocated footage of them raising the flag on the northern field north of Ostapivsk. However, the soldiers were then hunted down by Ukrainian drones, and this raises the question as to whether they even have control over Ostapivsk, as they do not have any footage of it being cleared. What we do know is that the Russian forces managed to enter behind the town, which indicates that at least the Ukrainian defenses there have been significantly weakened. In that case, I have put it in the gray zone as to show that the Russians do not have full control of it, according to the footage revealed, but the footage revealed does not show any significant Ukrainian presence either. With this, the Russians continue their pressure alongside the second line of defense, gain control over the eastern bank of the Haichu River alongside the defensive line, and continue offensive operations to gain control over the second line of defense in accordance with offensive operations along both the first and second lines of defense. In the direction of Novopavlivka, the Ukrainians counterattacked to regain control over some of these fortifications here to the south of Novopavlivka. The hourglass formation, as we see here, has been recaptured by the Ukrainians, and they are pushing along the first lines and first patches onwards towards the supply line of the Russian forces leading into Novopavlivka from the south, which shows that the Russians may lose their foothold within Novopavlivka if the Ukrainians are able to regain control over the roads leading into Novopavlivka, encircling the Russian forces present within the town, which would at this point... Initially, they had about 100 to 200 soldiers within the town, but after this long fighting, they'll have likely taken significant casualties, as the Ukrainians have been counterattacking non-stop ever since the Russians made their entry into the town. Of course, Ukrainians would also have taken a lot of casualties, but the point is the number of Russian soldiers would likely be less than 100 at this point. While the Russians were able to take advantage of the fog to enter Novopavlivka and gain control of the majority of the town, they were not able to cut off the logistics of the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians still have several towns and settlements in the near vicinity of Novopavlivka from where drone operators were present, allowing them to constantly strike the Russian positions throughout the town, and the Russian forces have limited logistics in the area, as the Ukrainians also launched their counterattack in the direction of Ivanivka simultaneously with their push in the direction of Novopavlivka. In generally, the Russian supplies and logistics are stretched thin in this section of the front line, as they are focusing further down southwest in the direction of Polyapole and in the direction of Pokrovsk to the northeast, which limits the logistics in the area, and the Russians were overstretched with the push into Novopavlivka and a significant amount of forces, forcing the Russian drone operators in the area to rather focus on logistics than strikes. Therefore, unless the Russians managed to reverse the situation, then they would have lost about 2 companies worth of forces for really nothing, because they ended up getting pushed back. And that is the importance of not overstretching your forces all throughout the front line, otherwise you would screw up. Further northeast in the direction of Vasilivka, the Russians gain control over the fortifications on the eastern flank of the town as they continue pushing through to gain full control of it and threaten the Ukrainian positions along the fortifications to the north and east of the town. The Russians are here working to gain control over the highway area, pushing through towards Minkivka, gaining control over the fortifications, pushing through from their weak spot, which is the southern flank, and then outflanking the fortifications and capturing them from the northern flank with a combined push from Selesnyansk from the east and Minkivka from the west to gain control over the fortifications in the area, clearing the way up towards Privilya, Holyubivka, and Minkivka. However, the Ukrainians are counterattacking and have strong positions in the area, including the fortifications and the settlements. The Ukrainian forces have a solid foothold in the area. This is why the Ukrainians did their best to prevent further Russian advances from Vasyakivka, as it outflanks the entire defensive position of Privilya, Holyubivka, and Minkivka by outflanking them from the eastern flank, and with the dam blown near Privilya, the river overflooded, allowing the Ukrainians to buy some extra time to establish some defensive positions here in the northwestern flank of Bundarne. As for the Siversk direction, the Russians made numerous advances both to the south of Platonivka in the direction of Zakitne, as well as the fortifications from the rear. Russians have started the offensive towards the fortifications on the western flank of Siversk, as they now almost have full control over Siversk itself. Russians have gained control over everything east of the Bakhmutovka River that splits Siversk into two, while they are already attempting to cross over into the western flank of the river line, where they're pushing up into the western outskirts of Siversk. However, again, even if they gain full control over Siversk, it will not be a stable hold until they gain control over the fortifications located on the high ground overlooking the town itself, and will simply increase the casualties of the Russian forces taken with the capture of the town. Therefore, the Russians started pushing from the rear, from Platonivka towards the fortifications to gain control over them. Getting control of these defensive lines will allow them to launch strong offensive operations and gain control over the fortifications overlooking the town, to consolidate the positions within it, and then push down south in the direction of Sviatopokrovsky and outflanking those fortifications as well, and develop offensive operations towards Zakitne in the western flank, where they're advancing both from the northern bank of the Seversk river line, where they're pushing alongside Zakitne from the northern flank to put pressure on the Ukrainian positions all throughout the town, with control over the western flank and now control over the eastern flank. Zakitne only has one road that properly supplies it, and that is from the southern direction, in the direction of Kryvya Luka and Kaliniki, where the defensive positions and defensive line here to the south is all connected to Zakitne. The capture of Zakitne and Siversk will allow the Russians to completely outflank the defensive line of the Ukrainians here to the south. In the northern section of the front line, the Ukrainians continue their counterattacks in the direction of Kupyansk, where the geolocated footage here confirms their presence in the northeastern parts of the city, which would indicate the Ukrainians have cut off the supply lines of the Russian forces here within Kupyansk. From the geolocated footage, the Ukrainian forces in the area were also attacked by Russian drones, which cleared them out. Following their push, they were a push from an ATV, which means that they do not have significant logistics nor a significant presence, but it also shows the weakness in the Russian defenses in the northern parts of the city. The Russians are here mainly centered around the apartment complex buildings in the northern parts of Kupyansk, which means everything north of it is limited in defense. The Russians would be able to clear it with operations. However, they would have a difficult time preventing the Ukrainians from regaining control of the areas, pushing through with a stronger force. Instead, they would likely focus around clearing the area at the same time as logistics come in, protecting that logistics. But other than that, the logistics will likely mostly come from the eastern flank and across the Oskar River line now, because of the Ukrainian presence in the northern parts of the city, further limiting the supplies for the Russian grouping of forces within Kupyansk, which is now getting limited in size due to the Ukrainian counterattacks. Finally, in the Vovchansk direction, the Russians continued offensive operations, gaining control over a wider area of Vilcha, gaining control of the central portions, the hospital area, and into the eastern outskirts of the town, where they're pushing through to gain full control of it. The Ukrainians are now pushed to the southern outskirts of it, where they are limited in presence. The Russians continued offensive operations within the Liman portion of the Kharkiv region, where they're pushing through the residential area in the western and eastern portions to gain full control over the town on the western flank. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.